When my daughter-in-law shoved me to the ground at our family dinner, fighting over what she thought was my will, she had no idea I was 3 steps ahead of her greedy schemes. The sound of my teacup shattering against the hardwood floor still echoes in my mind. Not because of the broken china. I'd lost far more precious things than that over the years. No. It echoes because that moment revealed the true character of the people I'd trusted most. My son stood frozen, watching his wife assault his mother, and he did nothing, absolutely nothing. But here's what Larkin didn't know as she clutched that leather folder like a prize. I'd been watching, I'd been learning, and most importantly, I'd been planning. Have you ever trusted someone completely, only to watch them turn against everything you've built? Have you witnessed a family member choose greed over love? Maybe you've seen the warning signs, the subtle comments, the calculated questions, the way someone's eyes light up when they talk about your possessions instead of your well-being. If you have, then you know the particular kind of heartbreak I'm about to share with you. It's the pain of watching someone you raised, someone you sacrificed everything for, become a stranger in your own home. My name is Gwendolyn, and I'm 73 years old. For the past 6 months, I've watched my daughter-in-law systematically plan to steal my life's work. She thought she was clever, thought I was just some doddering old woman who couldn't see what was happening right under my nose. She was wrong. This is the story of how a woman who underestimated me learned the hardest lesson of her life. It's about betrayal, yes, but it's also about something far more powerful, the quiet strength that comes from truly knowing your worth. What happened that night at dinner changed everything. But the real story, it started years before, with a young widow who refused to let the world tell her she couldn't survive on her own. The manipulation had been going on for months. The fake concerns about my memory, the real estate brochures left conveniently on my coffee table, the pointed questions about my plans for the future. Larkin thought she was playing chess while I was playing checkers. But I've been playing chess my entire life. Every move I made, every decision weighed against what I knew was coming. Because when you've survived what I've survived, when you've built what I've built with your own 2 hands, you develop instincts. You learn to read people. You learn to protect what matters most. And that night, when she finally showed her true face, when she put her hands on me and tried to take what she believed was rightfully hers, I was ready. If you've ever felt betrayed by family, hit that like button. You'll want to hear how this ends. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's simply being smarter than the people trying to destroy you. But to understand how I won this war, you need to understand how it all began. You need to know about the house, about the sacrifices, about the love that built something beautiful from nothing. You need to know about a woman who learned that the only person you can truly count on is yourself. Let me take you back to where this story really starts, not with a dinner gone wrong, but with a life built right, piece by piece, dollar by dollar, dream by dream. 45 years ago, I stood in the ashes of my old life, holding my 7-year-old son's hand while the funeral director handed me a bill I couldn't pay. Silas had been a dreamer, a beautiful, wonderful dreamer who saw magic in everything and possibility in everyone. He'd kiss me goodbye each morning and promise me the world, then come home with stories of deals that were almost there and investments that were sure things. I loved him for his optimism, but dreams don't pay mortgages. Dreams don't put food on the table. When the accident took him, a construction site incident that could have been prevented if the proper safety measures had been in place, I discovered just how far apart our dreams and reality had drifted. The debts were staggering. The life insurance policy he'd promised to increase, still the same small amount he'd taken out when Atticus was born. The business ventures that were going to make us rich, they were hemorrhaging money faster than water through broken pipes. The neighbors meant well, I suppose, but their whispers cut deeper than their condolences. "Poor Gwendolyn," they'd say, shaking their heads with that particular mixture of pity and superiority that people reserve for other people's tragedies. "She'll have to sell the place. A woman alone can't possibly manage all this." A woman alone. As if being alone made me less capable instead of more determined. I remember the exact moment I decided they were wrong. I was standing in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd served them coffee and cake during countless better times, and I could hear them through the thin walls discussing my future like I wasn't capable of deciding it for myself. Mrs. Henderson, from next door, was explaining to her sister how someone should probably help her find a nice apartment somewhere. I looked down at my engagement ring, the small diamond that Silas had saved for months to buy. It caught the morning light streaming through the window, and I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I walked straight to the jewelry store that afternoon and sold it. The money wasn't much, but it was enough to buy commercial baking supplies and rent space in the church kitchen after hours. If dreams wouldn't feed my son, then flour and sugar and the calluses on my hands would have to do. Those first months were brutal. I'd wake up at 4 a.m. to start the day's baking, work until 7 to get Atticus ready for school, then spend the day delivering orders to anyone who would give me a chance. Weddings, church functions, business meetings, I said yes to everything. My hands, once soft from a life of relative ease, became rough and strong. My back ached from lifting heavy trays and standing for 16 hours a day, but my bank account started growing. Slowly, painfully slowly, but growing. The catering business wasn't built on luck or connections or someone else's money. It was built on showing up every single day, no matter how tired I was or how much my feet hurt. It was built on making sure every cake was perfect, every meal was exactly what the customer wanted, every event ran smoothly. Word spread because the work spoke for itself. I bought my house the way I built my business, piece by piece, room by room, with pure determination and the kind of stubborn pride that comes from proving everyone wrong. The front room with its grand fireplace, that was paid for with the profits from the Morrison wedding, where I served 300 people with nothing but a borrowed van and sheer willpower. The sunroom where I now keep my orchids, that came from a corporate contract that saved me from bankruptcy during my 3rd year of business. The wraparound porch where I'd rock Atticus to sleep on summer evenings, that was built with money from countless church potlucks and birthday parties and anniversaries celebrated by people who trusted me with their most important moments. Every board, every nail, every coat of paint was earned. The house wasn't just where we lived. It was proof of what was possible when you refused to accept other people's limitations. And through it all, Atticus was watching. He saw me wake up before dawn and work past midnight. He saw me turn down social invitations because there was always another order to fill, another dollar to earn. another piece of our future to secure. I taught him about the quiet dignity of hard work while we planted tomatoes together. I showed him the value of $1 while he helped me count the day's earnings. I demonstrated the importance of keeping your word while I fulfilled every contract, no matter how small or how challenging. By the time Atticus was 18, the business was thriving, the house was completely paid for, and my reputation was unshakable. I was no longer the widow who couldn't possibly manage on her own. I was the woman who had built something from nothing, the woman who had proven everyone wrong. I thought I had taught my son everything he needed to know about strength, about character, about the difference between what you want and what you earn. I thought the values I'd instilled in him were unshakable. I was wrong about that. But I was absolutely right about one thing. I was stronger than anyone had imagined, including myself. And that strength was about to be tested in ways I never could have anticipated. Larkin arrived in our lives like a sudden frost in May, beautiful on the surface but deadly to everything growing underneath. When Atticus first brought her home, I wanted so desperately to love her. After years of watching him date women who never seemed to fit, never seemed to understand the depth of his character or appreciate the values he'd been raised with, Larkin appeared to be different. She was educated, articulate, and undeniably beautiful. She had a way of commanding attention when she walked into a room, and she seemed to genuinely care for my son. But from that very first visit, something felt off. While Atticus proudly showed her through the house, pointing out the hand-carved details on the banister, explaining the history behind the framed photographs on the mantel, sharing stories about helping me plant the garden, Larkin's eyes were calculating, not admiring, calculating. I watched her fingers trail along surfaces, not with the gentle appreciation of someone enjoying beautiful craftsmanship, but with the assessing touch of someone evaluating assets. She asked questions, but they weren't about the memories attached to things. They were about square footage, property values, and what it might cost to update everything. "This place has such potential," she told me that first evening, her smile bright but somehow cold. "The bones are good, but it could really use some modernization." Modernization, as if the lifetime of love and work I'd poured into every corner was somehow outdated, as if the careful restoration of original hardwood floors and the preservation of architectural details that told the story of craftsmanship from a different era were mistakes that needed correcting. I looked at my hands while she spoke, hands that showed every year of the work I'd done to build this life. My knickers were short and practical, my palms bore the permanent stains of a woman who worked with her hands, and there were scars from countless small injuries sustained in the pursuit of something greater than myself. Then I looked at Larkin's hands, perfectly manicured nails and a color that probably cost more than I used to spend on groceries for a week. Soft skin that had never known the bite of commercial dish soap or the rough texture of dough that needed kneading. Rings that sparkled with the kind of effortless beauty that comes from having nice things given to you rather than earned. There was nothing wrong with having beautiful hands, but there was something telling about the way she looked at mine, with a mixture of pity and incomprehension, as if she couldn't understand how someone could be content with visible proof of hard work. The differences between us became more apparent with each visit. Where I found joy in preparing meals from scratch, sharing family recipes that had been passed down through generations, Larkin preferred restaurants and takeout. Where I loved the ritual of Sunday dinners around the old oak table, with conversation flowing as easily as the wine, she seemed restless, constantly checking her phone or steering conversations toward topics that had nothing to do with family or tradition. But the most troubling change was in Atticus himself. My son had always been thoughtful, the kind of man who noticed when you were tired and insisted on doing the dishes, who remembered your favorite flowers and brought them home for no reason other than to see you smile. He had learned compassion from watching me struggle and succeed. He understood the value of small kindnesses because we depended on them during the hardest years. Under Larkin's influence, that thoughtfulness began to fade. Not all at once, that would have been too obvious, but gradually, like a photograph left too long in sunlight, the vibrant colors of his character started to bleach away. He stopped noticing when I was tired. He stopped asking about the business or showing interest in the stories I'd tell about particularly challenging catering jobs or especially happy celebrations. He became distracted during our conversations, his attention divided between what I was saying and what Larkin might need or want or think. The subtle changes in his behavior hurt, but what hurt more was watching him start to see our home, his childhood home, the place I'd sacrificed everything to provide, through her eyes instead of his own. "Mom, have you thought about updating the kitchen?" he asked one afternoon, his voice carrying a tone I'd never heard before. Not cruel, but dismissive, in a way that cut deeper than cruelty. Updated. The kitchen where I'd taught him to cook, where we'd spent countless hours talking about his dreams and fears and hopes for the future, where every appliance had been carefully chosen and every design decision had been made with both function and beauty in mind. I realized then that Larkin wasn't just changing how she saw the house, she was changing how she saw me. In her world, I wasn't a woman who had overcome impossible odds to create something beautiful. I was an aging obstacle to progress, a relic from a simpler time that needed to be gently but firmly moved aside so that younger, more sophisticated people could take over. The worst part wasn't her attitude toward me. I'd faced down plenty of people who underestimated me over the years. The worst part was watching my son, the boy I raised to value substance over surface, slowly start to adopt her perspective. He began making excuses for not visiting as often. When he did come by, the conversations felt strained, as if he was going through the motions of being a good son while secretly wishing he was somewhere else. The easy companionship we'd always shared gave way to polite distance. And through it all, Larkin smiled her perfect smile and made her subtle comments and gradually convinced the man I raised that his mother's way of life was somehow lesser than the one she offered. I should have seen then what was coming. The signs were all there, clear as the morning light streaming through the sunroom windows. But I made the mistake that so many mothers make. I hoped that love would be stronger than influence, that the values I instilled would prove more durable than her manipulation. I hoped that my son would remember who he used to be before she showed him who she thought he should become. But hope, as I was about to learn, isn't always enough. The transformation of my son from ally to stranger didn't happen overnight, but once it began, it moved with the relentless certainty of cancer. Larkin was a master of the art of suggestion. She never said anything directly confrontational, never made demands that would force Atticus to choose sides. Instead, she planted seeds of doubt with surgical precision, then watered them with perfectly reasonable-sounding concerns. "Mom, have you thought about downsizing?" became her favorite opening line during visits. She'd settle into my favorite chair, the one where I'd rocked Atticus as a baby, where I'd sit with my morning coffee and plan each day's work, and look around with that expression of gentle concern that made her words seem caring instead of calculating. "This house is so much work," she'd continue, her voice soft with manufactured worry. "Atticus and I have been talking about it, and we're concerned about you being up here all alone. What if something happened? What if you fell and no one found you for hours? The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who rarely called, who visited only when it was convenient, who had shown no genuine interest in my well-being, was suddenly worried about my safety. But Atticus would nod along with her concerns, his face serious, as if he hadn't grown up in this house, hadn't learned to navigate every creaky floorboard and understand every quirk of the old plumbing, as if he couldn't see that I was still perfectly capable of managing my own life. "Maybe Larkin has a point," he'd say, and each time those words came out of his mouth, a little more of my heart broke. "You're not getting any younger, and this place is a lot of responsibility." Responsibility. As if the home I'd built, the business I'd grown, the life I'd created, was a burden instead of an achievement. The real estate brochures started appearing around the same time. Glossy pamphlets featuring pristine apartments with names like Golden Years Manor and Sunset Village, places that promised maintenance-free living and on-site medical staff. They'd be casually left on my coffee table, tucked between magazines or placed next to my morning newspaper. "I just picked this up," Larkin would say with that bright, helpful smile. "Look at how nice these places are. And they have social activities. You could make new friends, have people to talk to. Wouldn't that be wonderful?" What would be wonderful, I wanted to tell her, was if my own family valued my independence enough to support it instead of undermining it. What would be wonderful was if my son remembered that I'd spent decades proving I could take care of myself and anyone else who needed it. But I held my tongue because I was still hoping that this phase would pass, that Atticus would remember who he was and what I'd taught him about loyalty and respect. Instead, the campaign intensified. Larkin began telling stories, carefully crafted anecdotes about elderly relatives who'd waited too long to make sensible housing decisions, tales of stubbornness that led to falls, forgetfulness that resulted in kitchen fires, isolation that ended in tragedy. "My Aunt Helen was just like you," she'd say, shaking her head sadly, "independent to a fault. She insisted she was fine living alone in that big old house until the day we found her at the bottom of the stairs. If only she'd listened when we tried to help her see reason." The stories were designed to frighten Atticus, and they worked. I could see him studying me with new eyes, looking for signs of the frailty and incompetence that Larkin insisted were inevitable. When I'd forget where I'd put my reading glasses or take a moment to remember someone's name, he'd exchange meaningful looks with her, as if my minor human lapses were evidence of impending mental decline. But the story served another purpose, too. They were reconnaissance missions, subtle attempts to gather information about my plans, my finances, my legal arrangements. Did Aunt Helen ever get her will updated? It's so important to have these things sorted out properly. You never know what might happen. Then she turned to me with that practiced expression of concern. "Speaking of which, Mom, do you have your affairs in order? Not that we're worried, of course, but it's just good planning." The questions came more frequently and became more specific. Where did I keep my important documents? Did I have a safe? Had I made arrangements with a lawyer? What were my wishes for the house? I started paying closer attention to my surroundings after these visits, and what I discovered made my blood run cold. Small things, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. A drawer in my study that was slightly more open than I'd left it. Files that had been shuffled through and hastily rearranged.
a decorative box that had been moved from its usual place on the bookshelf to the coffee table, such a minor detail that anyone else would have assumed they'd simply forgotten where they'd put it. But I hadn't moved that box. I never moved that box. It held my father's old pocket watch and some letters from Silas, items too precious to be handled casually. Someone was looking through my personal belongings, searching for something specific. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My own son was allowing his wife to violate my privacy, to treat my home like a treasure map where X marked the spot of my valuables and important papers. I tested my suspicions by making small changes to my study, moving papers to specific positions, arranging books in particular orders, placing items in locations where any disturbance would be obvious. After their next visit, everything had been subtly altered. My filing cabinet showed signs of careful searching. The old desk where I kept my personal correspondence had been opened and closed, the contents examined and replaced. They were looking for my will. The betrayal was complete now. Not only was Atticus allowing Larkin to manipulate him into seeing me as a burden to be managed, but he was actively participating in her scheme to prepare for my death. They were treating me like I was already gone, like my opinions and wishes about my own life and property were irrelevant obstacles to be overcome. Drop a comment if you've ever noticed these warning signs in your own family, because what happened next was a masterclass in manipulation and greed. The woman I'd welcomed into my home, the woman I'd tried so hard to love for my son's sake, wasn't just planning to inherit my life's work. She was planning to take it while treating me like an inconvenience to be tolerated until I was no longer in the way. But she had made one critical error in her calculations. She assumed that because I was older, I was naive. She assumed that because I'd been generous with my trust, I was foolish with my planning. She assumed that because I loved my son, I would allow him to betray me without consequences. She was wrong about all of it. And I was about to show her exactly how wrong she was.
The annual family dinner had always been sacred to me, a tradition that honored the work we'd done to build our life together and celebrated the bonds that made us a family. This year, it felt like walking into an execution. I'd spent days preparing, just as I always did. The dining room table was set with my grandmother's china, the pieces I'd carefully preserved through all the lean years, when selling them would have made life easier. The pot roast was perfectly seasoned, cooked with the same recipe I'd used since Atticus was small. The house smelled of cinnamon and vanilla from the apple pie cooling on the kitchen counter, and fresh flowers from my garden graced the mantelpiece. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for the tension that filled the air like smoke from a fire that hadn't been properly extinguished. Atticus arrived first, and for a moment I allowed myself to hope that maybe things could still be salvaged. He hugged me at the door. A real hug, not the perfunctory embrace he'd been offering lately, and complimented the food, the flowers, the way the evening light was streaming through the sunroom windows. "It smells like home in here," he said, and his voice carried echoes of the boy who used to help me set the table, who would sneak tastes of the dessert when he thought I wasn't looking. But then Larkin arrived. She swept into the room wearing a dress that cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget, something shimmering and deliberately elegant that seemed designed to highlight the contrast between her sophistication and what she clearly saw as my quaint domesticity. She air-kissed my cheek and complimented the table setting with the kind of practiced politeness that managed to sound both appreciative and condescending
at the same time. "How lovely," she said, running her fingers along the edge of my grandmother's china. "So vintage, so authentic." The way she said authentic made it clear that she meant outdated, and I watched my son's face as he registered the subtle criticism. Instead of defending the beauty of family heirlooms or the value of traditions that connected us to our history, he simply looked uncomfortable. My cousin Aveline arrived shortly after, bringing with her the kind of genuine warmth that made the contrast with Larkin even starker. Aveline had been like a sister to me during the hardest years, offering practical help and emotional support without judgment or agenda. She understood what the house meant, what the business had cost, what every carefully preserved tradition represented. The first course passed in relative peace, with conversation flowing around safe topics, the weather, local news, updates on mutual friends. But I could feel Larkin's impatience building like pressure in a steam kettle. Her smiles became more forced, her responses more clipped, and she kept shooting meaningful looks at Atticus as if silently urging him to begin whatever conversation they'd planned. It was during the main course that she finally dropped all pretense of enjoying the evening. "This pot roast is delicious," she began, and for a moment I thought she might be making a genuine effort. "It must take so much time to prepare meals like this, especially for someone who's who has so much to manage on their own." The pause before "getting" was calculated, designed to plant the suggestion of decline without actually saying the words. And the implication that cooking a family dinner was somehow evidence of my inability to manage my life was so insulting it took my breath away. "I enjoy cooking. I always have." "Oh, I know you do," Larkin said, her voice dripping with false concern. "But sometimes we have to acknowledge when things become, difficult, when we start forgetting things or mixing up ingredients or—" "I haven't forgotten anything," I interrupted, my voice sharp enough to cut through her manufactured sympathy. "Of course not," she said quickly, but her smile had a quality that made my skin crawl. "It's just that Atticus and I have been talking, and we've noticed some changes, little things. Nothing serious, of course, but—" She launched into a fabricated story about a supposed grocery list I'd forgotten, complete with details about items I'd allegedly repeated and confusion over simple purchases. The story was entirely fictional, but it was told with such conviction that I could see Atticus beginning to believe it. "Remember last week, Mom, when you asked us to pick up milk, but then you couldn't remember if you had already bought some?" I stared at my son, this man I'd raised to value truth above all convenience, and realized he was actively participating in gaslighting me. The milk incident never happened, but he was willing to pretend it had if it served their purposes. "These things happen as we get older," Larkin continued, her voice now taking on the tone of someone addressing a child. "It's perfectly natural, nothing to be embarrassed about, but it does make us wonder if you've given any thought to making arrangements." And there it was, the real reason for this performance. "Arrangements?" I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. "For the future," Atticus said, finally finding his voice in this betrayal. "For the house, for your care, for everything." Larkin leaned forward, her eyes bright with anticipation. "We've been so worried about you, Mom. This house is such a responsibility, and if your memory is starting to, if things are getting harder to manage—" "What exactly are you asking me?" I said, my voice deadly quiet. The pretense finally shattered completely. "We're asking about the will," Larkin snapped, her patience exhausted. She set her fork down with enough force to make everyone at the table jump. We need to know where we stand. It's only fair. Fair. The same word she'd used months ago when this campaign of manipulation began, as if fairness had anything to do with their scheme to steal my life's work. Fair, I repeated, my voice carrying the weight of every sacrifice I'd made, every sleepless night I'd worked, every dream I'd built into reality. What exactly do you think is fair, Larkin? That a legacy built on 45 years of sacrifice should be handed over for your convenience? Her mask dropped completely then, revealing the raw greed that had been driving this entire performance. "Oh, stop being so dramatic," she hissed. "It's a legal formality. The will is in your study, isn't it? Just give it to us." She lunged forward then, her hand reaching for the small leather folder I'd placed beside my plate. It contained old family photographs, but in her fevered state of greed, she assumed it held the document she'd been searching for. I tried to pull it back, but her grip was like steel. The struggle was brief but violent, a shocking display of raw avarice that shattered the last illusion of civility. And then she shoved me. The force of it caught me completely off guard. I stumbled backward, my chair scraping loudly across the hardwood floor before I fell, my teacup shattering into pieces around me. The sound echoed through the stunned silence like a gunshot. For a moment, nobody moved. The horror of what had just happened hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Atticus stood frozen, his face a mask of shock and shame. But he didn't rush to help me. He didn't confront his wife. He didn't do anything at all, except stand there, his silence a louder betrayal than any words could have been. It was Aveline who broke the paralysis, rushing to my side to help me up. My elbow throbbed where it had struck the floor, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the ache in my heart as I looked at my son and saw nothing but cowardice staring back at me. Larkin, meanwhile, clutched the folder like a trophy, her chest heaving with exertion and triumph. She thought she'd won. She thought the will was finally hers. But as I rose to my feet with Aveline's support, accepting her support while my own son offered nothing, I felt something settle in my chest. Not defeat, not despair, clarity. "You have what you wanted, Larkin," I said, my voice clear despite the shock. Her smirk was sickening in its satisfaction. But her victory was about to become the most humiliating moment of her life. Standing in my dining room, surrounded by the shattered pieces of my grandmother's teacup and the even more broken pieces of my family, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. This was the moment I'd been preparing for, even when I didn't fully realize I was preparing for it. All those months of watching Larkin's manipulation, of enduring her fake concern, and witnessing my son's transformation into someone I barely recognized, had led to this. She stood there clutching that leather folder, her face flushed with victory and exertion, breathing hard from the violence she'd just committed. Her perfect facade had finally cracked completely, revealing the ugly truth underneath. But what she didn't realize was that her moment of triumph was about to become her greatest humiliation. "But you fought for a lie," I said, my voice dropping to barely above a whisper, which somehow commanded the attention of everyone in the room more effectively than shouting would have. Larkin's triumphant expression faltered slightly. "What are you talking about?" I brushed the dust from my dress with deliberate, dignified movements, taking my time to let the suspense build. My elbow ached where I'd fallen, but I ignored the pain. This moment was too important to be diminished by physical discomfort. "That folder you just assaulted me to obtain," I said, gesturing toward the leather case she held like a prize, "contains my will. Yes, but not the will you think you need." The confusion on her face was almost comical. "What do you mean?" I reached into the pocket of my dress, the same dress she'd probably dismissed as another example of my outdated sensibilities, and withdrew a folded document. The paper was crisp, official, bearing the raised seal that marked it as a legal instrument of considerable importance. "The document you fought for," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word, "is my will for personal property. My jewelry, my silver, the contents of my garden shed, my furniture, all the trinkets and treasures that fill this house." Larkin's face began to drain of color as the implications of my words started to sink in. "But the deed to this house," I said, unfolding the document slowly, letting each crease release like a note in a symphony of justice, "is not in my will at all. It's right here." The gasps from the family were audible, but I kept my eyes fixed on Larkin's face as comprehension dawned. Her look of triumph was transforming into something approaching horror. "You see," I continued, my voice now carrying the quiet authority of a woman who had always been 3 steps ahead of her adversaries, "6 months ago, when I first noticed small items in my study being moved, when it became clear that someone was searching through my personal belongings, when it became clear that my own son was allowing his wife to violate my privacy in preparation for my death, I made a decision." Atticus's face had gone ashen. The shame was written across his features so clearly that even he couldn't deny what he'd participated in. "I had this house and all its land legally transferred as a gift to someone who actually deserves it, someone who understands what this place truly represents, someone who has shown me love and respect instead of greed and manipulation." I turned to look at Ondine, my granddaughter, who had been sitting quietly through this entire ordeal. Her eyes were wide with shock, but there was something else there too. Pride and a deep, abiding love that made my heart swell even in this moment of family destruction. Ondine had never asked me for anything. She'd never made calculations about property values or suggested that my independence was a burden. She had simply loved me, sitting with me on the porch during summer evenings, listening to stories about how each room had been earned, helping me tend the garden without complaint, sharing quiet moments of companionship that required nothing more than presence and affection. She saw the house not as an asset to be liquidated, but as a home to be cherished. She understood that the true value wasn't in the square footage or the market price, but in the untold stories of sacrifice and resilience that had built its very foundation. "The deed to this house," I announced, my voice ringing with finality, "was signed over to Ondine 6 months ago. She is now the legal owner of everything you thought you were entitled to." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of quiet that follows an explosion when the dust is still settling and people are trying to understand what just happened. Larkin stood frozen, the useless folder still clutched in her hands, her face cycling through expressions of disbelief, rage, and dawning comprehension. The will she had fought so desperately to obtain, the document she had assaulted me to possess, was worth nothing more than the paper it was written on when it came to the property she actually wanted. You can't," she stammered, her composure completely shattered. "I can," I said simply, "and I did. 6 months ago, when it became clear that you saw my death as a business opportunity rather than a loss to be mourned." Atticus finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" The pain in his voice almost broke my resolve, but I couldn't let sentiment override justice. "Tell you?" I repeated, my voice gentle but firm. "Tell you that I was protecting my life's work from people who were already treating me like I was dead? Tell you that I had to make arrangements to ensure my legacy went to someone who actually valued it? He had no answer for that because there was no answer. He knew what he'd participated in. He knew what he allowed. Larkin, meanwhile, had moved past shock into pure rage. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You're a senile old woman, and this can't be legal. We'll fight it. We'll, what?" I interrupted, my voice deadly calm. "Contest the legal gift of property from a woman of sound mind to her granddaughter. Challenge the decision of someone who built everything she owned with her own hands to give it to someone who respects what it represents." I gestured around the dining room, at the hand-carved molding, the carefully restored hardwood floors, the family photographs that chronicled decades of love and struggle and triumph. "Go ahead," I continued. "Explain to a judge why you believe you're entitled to the fruits of my labor. Tell them about your campaign of manipulation, your fake concerns about my memory, your systematic violation of my privacy. Describe how you pushed a 73-year-old woman to the ground in your eagerness to claim what you thought was yours." Her face flushed crimson with fury and humiliation. The public exposure of her greed was a punishment far worse than any legal battle could have been. Everyone in the room had witnessed her true nature, and there was no taking it back. "Atticus," she hissed, turning to my son with venom in her voice, "we're leaving now." But before he could respond, I stepped forward, my voice carrying the weight of every sacrifice I'd made for him, every lesson I tried to teach him, every moment of love I'd poured into raising him. "Yes," I said quietly, "you are leaving. Both of you, and you're not welcome back." The words hung in the air like a funeral bell tolling. Atticus looked at me with something approaching desperation, as if he was finally understanding what his choices had cost him. "Mom, please," he said, his voice breaking. "I never meant, I didn't think." "That's exactly the problem," I replied, my heart breaking even as I held my ground. "You didn't think. You let her think for you. You let her convince you that your mother was an obstacle instead of the woman who sacrificed everything to give you a future." Larkin grabbed his arm with enough force to leave marks. "Come on," she snapped. "We don't need this. We don't need her." And just like that, my son made his final choice. He didn't argue with her. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't even look back as she dragged him toward the door. The sound of that door closing behind them was the sound of a relationship ending, of a family tree losing a branch that had grown too diseased to save. But as I stood in my dining room, surrounded by the people who truly loved me, Aveline with tears in her eyes, Undine with her quiet strength and infinite compassion, I didn't feel defeated. I felt free. Smash that subscribe button if you believe in justice, because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's simply being smarter than the people trying to destroy you.
The days following the dinner were strangely peaceful, like the calm that settles after a violent storm has finally passed. I won't lie to you, there was grief, deep, aching grief for the son I'd lost, not to death, but to choices that had made him a stranger. There were moments when I'd catch myself starting to call him about something small and important, a funny story I'd heard, a memory that had surfaced, a question about his childhood that only he could answer, before remembering that he was gone. But grief, I've learned, can coexist with relief, and the relief of no longer living under the constant threat of manipulation, no longer having to watch every word and guard every possession, was profound. Undine moved in the following week, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She understood that the house was meant to be lived in, loved in, shared with people who appreciated its history and its heart. Tell me about the sunroom, she said, on her first morning, sitting across from me at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee made from my grandmother's recipe. I want to know everything, why you chose to build it there, what it felt like when you finally had the money saved, what you were thinking the first time you sat in it. And I told her. I told her about working 16-hour days to save enough for that addition, about the corporate catering contract that made it possible, about the first morning I'd sat surrounded by my orchids and realized that I'd built something truly beautiful. She listened the way Atticus used to listen before Larkin taught him that my stories were inconvenient relics of a past that didn't matter. She asked questions that showed she understood the deeper meaning, not just what I'd built, but why it mattered, what it represented, how each room held memories that were more valuable than any market assessment. We established new routines quickly. Morning coffee on the porch, watching the garden wake up with the sun. Afternoons working together on small projects, touching up paint, organizing old photographs, planning new flower beds. Evenings cooking together, with me teaching her the family recipes and techniques I'd perfected over decades of trial and error. The secret to good bread, I told her, guiding her hands as she kneaded dough, isn't just in the ingredients. It's an understanding that the dough will tell you what it needs if you pay attention. Too dry, and it fights you. Too wet, and it won't hold its shape. But when it's just right, it becomes something alive under your hands. She learned quickly, not just the techniques, but the philosophy behind them. That good food comes from patience and attention. That the best meals are made with love as much as skill. That feeding people is one of the most fundamental ways to show you care about their well-being. The house began to feel alive again in ways it hadn't for months. The tension that had hung in the air like smoke was gone, replaced by the comfortable energy of people who belonged together. Laughter echoed through the rooms again. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and vanilla and all the warm scents that make a house feel like home. 3 weeks after the dinner, Larkin made one last attempt to reclaim what she thought should have been hers. She arrived without Atticus, her face hard with determination and legal documents clutched in her manicured hands. "I've spoken with lawyers," she announced from my front porch, her voice carrying the kind of false confidence that comes from desperation disguised as authority. "This transfer can be challenged. Elderly people are often taken advantage of by family members who—" I didn't let her finish. "Ondine," I called over my shoulder, "would you please bring me the folder from my desk, the blue one?" When Ondine returned, I opened the folder and showed Larkin its contents. Medical evaluations from 3 different doctors, all confirming my mental competency at the time of the transfer. Cognitive assessments demonstrating that my decision-making abilities were not only intact, but sharp. Character references from business associates, friends, and community members attesting to my sound judgment. "I've been planning for this conversation since the day I signed those papers," I told her calmly. "Every possible legal challenge you might raise has been anticipated and documented against. The transfer is ironclad." Her face crumbled as the reality hit her. There was no legal path to what she wanted, no technicality to exploit, no weakness in my planning to attack. "You did this on purpose," she said, her voice hollow with the realization of total defeat. "Yes," I replied without apology. "I did. The moment I realized what you were planning, I made plans of my own, better plans, smarter plans, plans that put my legacy in the hands of someone who deserves it." She left without another word, and I knew she wouldn't be back.
the fight had gone out of her completely. Atticus never came back either. Sometimes I wonder if he thinks about the choice he made, if he regrets allowing his wife to poison him against the woman who raised him. But I can't let myself dwell on those thoughts for long. Some relationships, no matter how deep their roots, become too toxic to save. Instead, I focus on the relationships that flourish. Undine and I have created something beautiful together, a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection. She's learning the skills she'll need to maintain the house and continue the traditions that make it special. I'm learning that legacy isn't just about what you leave behind, but about who you trust to carry it forward. The garden has never looked better. We've planted new varieties alongside the old ones, creating combinations of color and fragrance that surprise and delight. The house itself seems to appreciate the attention. Old wood gleaming with fresh polish, windows sparkling in the morning light, every room alive with the energy of people who understand its value. Sometimes losing the people who don't truly love you is the only way to fully appreciate the ones who do.
As I sit here today, 6 months after that terrible dinner, I want to share with you what I've learned about family, about betrayal, and about the quiet power that comes from truly knowing your worth. The first lesson is this: blood doesn't guarantee loyalty. The people who are supposed to love you most can sometimes be the ones most willing to sacrifice your well-being for their own convenience. It's a hard truth, but it's one that every wise person must eventually acknowledge. For years, I operated under the assumption that because I had raised Atticus with love and sacrifice, because I had given him every advantage I could provide, because I had built something beautiful for him to inherit, his loyalty was assured. I believed that the bond between mother and child was unbreakable, that the values I'd instilled would prove stronger than any outside influence. I was wrong about that, and the wrongness nearly cost me everything. But being wrong about one thing taught me to be right about something far more important: the power of preparation. You see, I could have waited until it was too late. I could have hoped that love would triumph over greed, that my son would eventually remember who he was and choose me over his wife's manipulations. I could have trusted that everything would work out simply because I deserved better treatment. Instead, I chose to act. When I first noticed the signs of what was coming, I didn't ignore them or make excuses or hope they would go away. I documented them. I prepared for them. I made decisions based on reality rather than wishful thinking. That's the second lesson. Hope is beautiful, but preparation is practical. And when you're dealing with people who see your death as their opportunity, practical is what keeps you safe. The third lesson is about choosing your battles wisely. I didn't fight Larkin's manipulation with drama or confrontation. I didn't try to force Atticus to choose between us or make emotional appeals about loyalty and gratitude. Instead, I quietly, methodically, legally removed the prize she was fighting for and placed it in hands I could trust. She thought she was playing chess while I was playing checkers, but I was actually playing a game she didn't even know existed. The fourth lesson is about the difference between revenge and justice. Revenge would have been finding ways to hurt them back, to make them suffer as they had made me suffer. Justice was simply ensuring that my life's work went to someone who would treasure it rather than someone who would exploit it. I didn't need to destroy them. I just needed to protect what I'd built. But perhaps the most important lesson is about recognizing true family when you find it. Andi may be my granddaughter by blood, but more importantly, she's my heir by choice. She earned that position not through genetics, but through character, not through expectation, but through appreciation. The people who truly belong in your life are the ones who see your worth without being told, who support your dreams without being asked, who stand by you during difficulties without calculating what it costs them. Family isn't just about who raised you or who shares your DNA. Family is about who shows up when you need them, who celebrates your victories without jealousy, who respect what you've built instead of planning how to tear it down. Today, when I wake up in the morning and walk through the rooms I earned with my own hands, when I sit in my garden surrounded by flowers I planted and tended, when I teach family recipes to someone who actually wants to learn them, I don't feel bitter about what I lost. I feel grateful for what I saved. The house is still here, more beautiful than ever. The garden still blooms with color and fragrance that took decades to achieve. The traditions continue, passed on to someone who understands their value. And I'm still here, still strong, still capable of protecting what matters most. Sometimes people ask me if I regret being so harsh with my son, if I worry that I was too unforgiving. My answer is always the same. I didn't push him away. I simply stopped chasing someone who was already running. The people who belong in your life don't require you to diminish yourself to keep them. They don't ask you to ignore their disrespect or accept their betrayal. They don't treat your love like a weakness to be exploited. The people who deserve your trust earn it through their actions, not their promises. They prove their loyalty through consistency, not convenience. They show their love through protection, not exploitation. I learned that strength isn't about enduring abuse or accepting betrayal because you love someone. Real strength is about recognizing when love isn't being returned, when sacrifice isn't being appreciated, when trust isn't being honored. Real strength is about protecting what you've built from people who would destroy it, even when those people share your last name. The sun still rises over my garden each morning, casting golden light on the house I built with determination and the legacy I secured with wisdom. The rooms still hold the echoes of laughter and love, but now they're filled with people who actually hear the music. This story isn't just about one woman's fight against greed and manipulation. It's about the power we all have to write our own endings, to choose our own families, to protect our own legacies. You don't have to wait for other people to value what you've built. You don't have to accept betrayal because it comes from familiar faces. You don't have to let anyone treat your life's work like their inheritance before you're ready to give it. Trust your instincts. Document your concerns. Plan for the worst while hoping for the best. And never, ever let anyone make you feel guilty for protecting what you've earned. Because at the end of the day, the people who truly love you will understand why you did what you had to do. And the people who don't understand, well, they were never your real family anyway. What would you have done in my situation? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of strength and survival. Because every one of us deserves to live in the house we built, surrounded by people who appreciate the work it took to build it. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to let anyone take that away from you.